on the door handle. For a horrible instant, her face was framed by the passenger window, her diseased mouth pressed up against the glass, her teeth scratched against the window, her tongue darting out and touching it, testing it like a finger. He saw a smear of dark blood forming across the glass, and a terrible thought occurred to him. They used this one as a decoy. Someone had actually cleaned her up enough that she could pass for one of the uninfected, and was using her as a decoy. But there was no time to follow the thought through to its implications, for at that moment the little girl jumped onto the hood of the car and started kicking the windshield with her heel. Richardson heard a pop, and then the soft, almost liquid splash of glass breaking. Bright white spiderweb cracks formed along its surface. The windshield separated from the top of the roof and sagged inward, held together now only by the protective plastic film on the inside of the glass. Through the shattered windshield he saw the little girl's ruined face. The glass gave way with a series of loud pops, and the next instant it was draped over him like a sheet, with the girl on top of it, shredding her hands to bloody ribbons as she tried to claw her way through to Richardson.
"Help! God damn it! Get me out of here!"
His arms were pinned between the seat and the steering wheel, and he couldn't get the leverage he needed to push the girl off him.
"Sylvia! Help me!"
The little girl's snarls got louder. Bits of broken glass were flying all around her face. Her blood was spattering across the dashboard, running down into the puddles of water that had collected on the floorboards. Richardson was kicking madly at the passenger door, trying to get leverage against the girl's weight, when suddenly there was a shot. Her face seemed to swell above him, actually growing larger, until it slopped down on the remnants of the windshield and oozed off onto the floorboards. Her headless corpse sagged down on top of him.
"Ben?"
It was Sylvia's voice.
"Ben, are you okay?"
He looked to his left and saw part of the little girl's face on the floorboard, empty, bloody eye sockets staring up at him.
"Ben?"
"Get her off me, Sylvia. Jesus, hurry." The passenger door opened, and they pulled the little girl's body off him.
"Careful about the glass,"
Sylvia said, and she helped him sit up and then climb out of the wrecked car. He stood and checked himself for wounds, any possible sign of infection.
"You okay?"
Sylvia asked. "Yeah, I think so."
"Come here," she said. "There's something you need to see."
She turned and walked down the driveway. The 2 adult female zombies were there. Both, he realized, had an ear missing.
"Look at that,"
Sylvia said, pointing to one of the zombies. The woman had been wearing jeans and an Ohio Buckeyes sweatshirt. She looked like a scarecrow inside the baggy clothes. Not sure what he was supposed to be seeing, he let his gaze wander down to her ankles. One of her pant legs had been pulled up to her knee, revealing a small black box about the size of a pack of cigarettes strapped to her ankle. It was beeping quietly. "What is that?" he asked.
"It's an ankle monitor,"
Sylvia said.
"The kind they used to put on people who were on house arrest."
He was still feeling a little sick from all the adrenaline going through his system, and it was hard to focus. A lot of half-formed questions rose up in his mind, but he wasn't able to articulate them. "Why?" was all he managed.
"They were tracking her. They were tracking her while she was tracking us."
"Who?"
"Isn't that obvious?"
He looked at her, still confused.
"The Red Man," she said. "Remember last night when we told you his father used to be chief of police in Gatling? Where else do you think they would have gotten this kind of equipment?"
"I don't," he said, and then trailed off with a shrug. "Why not just capture us?"
"I think that's obvious. The Red Man is hoping we'll lead him to Don Fisher."
"Why us? Doesn't he have Nicky?"
"That's exactly my point,"
Sylvia said. She looked almost triumphant.
"If he's tracking us, That means he hasn't gotten anything from Nikki. Best case scenario, that means she's still alive, still holding out.
He almost said, but the worst case. Fortunately, he stopped himself. Avery was hanging on their every word. He looked at her and nodded. Then he turned back to Sylvia. His head was beginning to clear now. He examined the car where he had nearly died. There was blood all over it, running down the hood and the fenders. Richardson let out a long breath, and then turned his attention back to the blinking ankle monitor. "Do you think they have any way of knowing we killed their trackers?" Sylvia shrugged, but before she could answer, they heard the sound of trucks in the distance.
"It's him," Avery said. "What do we do? We gotta hide."
"Not in the building," Richardson said. "That's the first place they'll look."
"Where?"
Sylvia said. Richardson reached into his pack and removed the tarp he'd made from the old ghillie suit. "Under here," he said. He looked around, and his gaze fell on a section of an overgrown ditch, thick with tall brown weeds. "Over there, that ditch across the street. Come on." Chapter 8. Nate Royal woke with a fire burning in his head. He blinked his eyes open, and the daylight stabbing in on his eyes only made the pain worse. Groaning, he fell back into the hammock he'd suspended between the service station's rusting gas pumps and closed his eyes. He was not doing well. His skin was filmed over with a cold sweat. Sometimes he felt like he was burning up. Other times there didn't seem to be enough blankets in the world to keep him warm. The clouds in his head never seemed to clear, and even when he tried to work through it, really concentrate, his heart would start to race and he'd grow short of breath. Not for the first time that week, he wondered if he was going to die. He suspected that what he had right now was the flu. A really bad case of it. There'd been that old man he'd shared a campfire with the week before, the one who kept him up all night with his hacking cough and sneezing and his moaning in his sleep. Maybe he got it from him. But did it really matter? Hadn't he been going downhill for a while now, anyway? Even if he hadn't gotten sick from that miserable old man, he would still be in a bad way. He was hungry all the time. His face was so badly sunburned that he could barely touch it. He kept losing his supplies. They were stolen or misplaced or forgotten, whatever. They just disappeared on him. A lot like the rest of the world. He'd seen a farmhouse a few miles down the road, but had decided to pass it by because there might have been people sleeping inside, and he didn't want to be around them while he was sick. He felt weak and defenseless, and all he wanted to do was curl up like a dog behind some bushes somewhere and hide, to be by himself. Now he realized how stupid that had been. What he needed was someplace warm to rest, some clean water to drink. What he needed— The thought broke off cleanly. He heard the muffled cracking sound of glass breaking underfoot, and suddenly he knew he was being watched. Very slowly he opened his eyes and turned his aching head toward the sound. There were 3 of them, standing there, watching him. A little girl of about 10, just a few feet from him, and 2 older women behind her. They stood absolutely still, draped in the shadows of the gas station's awning like something materializing out of a nightmare. They didn't make a sound. Even through the fever clouds in his head, he knew they were infected. He could see it in their yellowed, bloodshot eyes, and the way the flesh slacked off the bones of their face, and the deep, black hollows under their eyes. The 2 women had dried blood all over them. It was matted in their hair and crusted around their mouths and down the front of their clothes. But not the little girl. She was a zombie too, he knew that. But she was wearing clean clothes, and her hair, though oily and dirty, was free of blood. He was hallucinating, he decided. A trick of the shadows. Nate raised a hand. his index finger outstretched as though he was about to lecture them, and then he let it fall. He didn't have the energy, not even to defend himself.
"Go ahead and kill me,"
he muttered.
"You got me netted in this thing like a country ham. You ain't gonna get a better chance."
A country ham. He'd seen a bunch of them hanging in fishnet bags from a ceiling in a ruined deli in Atlanta a few years earlier. In the dark, he'd seen spiders moving all over them. Now he was the country ham, and the zombies were the spiders. But the thought didn't frighten him. Nate wasn't afraid of the infection that the zombies carried, for reasons that had been explained to him many times, and yet he still didn't understand. He was immune to the necrosis filovirus. He had been bitten at least 14 times in the last 8 years, with the attendant scars to prove it. But the disease was unable to gain purchase in his body. When the quarantine wall fell, Nate had been living in Martindale, Pennsylvania, with his dad and his dad's girlfriend, Mindy. Up through his mid-20s, he'd led a thoroughly disappointing life. One spent drinking beer and smoking dope and watching lots of porn and pretty much avoiding anything remotely close to responsibility. But that all changed when the outbreak spread through the East Coast like a wildfire. Bitten by a zombie during the evacuation, he'd retreated, scared and all alone, into a neighbor's lawnmower shed. Shortly afterwards, a roving military squad discovered him and put him in a holding cell with hundreds of other infected victims. But while the others became zombies, he did not. And for several hours he clung to the top of a chain-link fence, with hundreds of the infected snarling below him, reaching for him, while soldiers in biohazard suits watched him from the other side of the fence. Finally, he was taken down by a team of military doctors and turned into a lab rat. But they did derive a cure from his blood. And if only the doctors who worked on him had lived, he thought, maybe that would have counted for something. He blinked at the zombies. They were still standing there, watching him.
"Come on, do it."
But they didn't move. Their eyes shone in the dark. The weight of their stares was oppressive. He could smell the faint charnel house odor of them in the still morning air, but he couldn't hear them breathing. They were enveloped by stillness so perfect, so absolute, that they seemed to have been transmuted into granite, like statues in a graveyard. A chill crept over Nate's skin, and he shivered involuntarily.
"Run,"
he thought. He was immune to their sickness, but that didn't matter. Their stillness was something completely new. It terrified him, and that little voice inside his head began to scream,
"Run! Get away as fast as you can!"
Then, without warning, all 3 zombies turned their heads as one and stared down the road. And that simple gesture, like their heads were all mounted on the same pivot, turned by the same dial, scared him even more than their stillness had. He leaned his head forward and tried to see what they were looking at, but there was nothing there. Nate turned back to the zombies.
"What are you—"
But he trailed off, the question left unasked. The zombies were leaving. They turned and walked into the daylight, staggering along a crooked path through the woods at the edge of the pavement. One by one, they slipped into the woods.
"What the—"
With effort, he climbed out of the hammock and stumbled to the edge of the awning shadow line, one hand on a rusted pole to support his weight. He watched the zombies disappear into the thicket, and he realized with a sense of horror and shame that he had been ready to die. Had they attacked him, he would have welcomed the death that followed. He rubbed the computer flash drive that hung from a lanyard around his neck and coughed. Had it really come to this? Was he really giving up? There used to be writing on the flash drive, but it was worn down and faded now from all the long nights he spent rubbing it with his thumb, thinking about Dr. Mark Kellogg, the man who had encoded the cure onto the drive, and then slipped it into Nate's hand as he lay dying. He tucked the flash drive back inside his shirt. "We are put into this hostile, alien world as isolated individuals," Kellogg had told him, shortly before he died of suicide by pistol to keep from turning into a zombie. "We can learn to like other people, even love them. But we can't ever truly know them, and so we remain isolated. We're not allowed to know why life has meaning. Not for sure, anyway. And yet we feel compelled to create some sort of answer. It's an absurd downward spiral of impossible things. And yet it is our lives." Nate leaned on the support pole and stared miserably into the thicket where the zombies had disappeared. He'd never felt so lonely as he did now. More than fast cars, more even than pretty girls, he missed Kellogg. In the short time he'd known him, Kellogg had become like the father Nate never had. His own father, his real father, was a small, stupid man who saw in Nate a reflection of his own limitations and failure. They had hated one another, and as far as Nate was concerned, the outbreak was about the best thing that had ever happened to them. But Kellogg was different. He had taken the time to talk with Nate, really talk with him. He explained how sometimes the world didn't make sense. He explained how the only thing that really mattered was looking for a way to make life make sense. The answer itself didn't matter, because there probably wasn't one. Not a perfect one, anyway. Only the looking for an answer made any difference, because when you stopped looking, you started dying. Sometimes Kellogg spoke to him. Nate, from time to time, saw him standing next to him, heard him talking with him. He had met a Thai man around Phoenix several years back, who told him that holy people sometimes communed with the ghosts of those who had been important in their lives and still had lessons to teach. And sometimes Nate liked to think that the vision he saw was really the ghost of Kellogg trying to keep him alive. It was a pleasant thing to believe. But of course, Kellogg hadn't appeared to him lately. Nate closed his eyes, and he could almost hear the man saying, "Even a world defined by bad reasons can give you cause to live. You must find those reasons, whatever they may be."
"But I tried,"
Nate said. He opened his eyes and scanned the crumbling gas station around him.
"I tried really hard."
Kellogg was standing there, smiling calmly. Nate smiled back.
"Hey, Doc."
"The cure, Nate. That's your reason. You have to get it to somebody who knows how to use it."
"But what else am I supposed to do? I can't go much farther."
But Kellogg was gone. Nate waved a fly away from his face. He heard the noise of a young woman's voice coming from the road, and instinctively he stepped back into the shadows.
"Stop, watch, and listen before you meet new people. Be careful what you tell them. Know who they are before they know you."
That had been some of Kellogg's best advice to him. It saved him numerous times over the years, and he followed it now without hesitation. Turning toward the gas station, he happened to catch his reflection in a grimy, jagged triangle of glass still clinging to the edge of the window, and he sucked in a shocked breath. It was a world without mirrors, and it had been a long time since he'd seen his reflection. He hadn't been a bad-looking guy back in the day. He'd had a few girlfriends, but he looked bad now. He'd lost so much weight. His hair was down past his shoulders, ratty with oil and dirt, as was his beard. Flies swarmed around his face, dipping now and then toward the raw, sunburned cracks in his skin.
"No wonder they didn't attack you,"
he thought, then waved the flies away from his face and disappeared into the shadows of the station's service bays, where it was hot and smelled dusty and stale. There were 3 of them, a man and a woman who looked to be in their 50s, and a younger girl, who looked to be about 20. The girl looked nice. A little thick around the middle, maybe, but nice. She had pretty blonde hair, and Nate hadn't seen that in a long time. The man and the woman were out front as they approached the service station, and only then did Nate realize he'd left all his gear strung up out there. They'd steal it all, he realized, and then, Christ, not again. Why couldn't he hold on to his gear? He thought maybe he had time to dart out and grab it before they saw him. But then the pretty blonde girl stepped around the man and the woman and pointed at the hammock and said, "What's that?" Damn it, Nate thought. "A hammock," the man said. Nate studied the three, and it took him a long moment to realize that the man was dressed differently from the two women. The women wore baggy sweatshirts and BDU-style pants over Magnum high-tech boots that looked practically brand new. But the man wore jeans and a long-sleeve T-shirt and tennis shoes that were held together near the toe with duct tape. He carried a heavy-looking backpack and a pistol at his belt, and he looked to be the only one who was armed. Maybe they were okay. They looked okay. The man came forward and examined the place where the hammock's ropes were tied onto the gas pumps. "Hello?" he called out.
"Ben," the older woman hissed. "What are you doing?"
Kellogg appeared at Nate's shoulder. "Wait a moment," he said. "Just wait and watch. Know who they are before they know who you are."
"Okay,"
Nate whispered. He watched them. They were looking around, studying his meager possessions on the ground, when a glass bottle scraped along the asphalt down at the road. All three of them turned at the same time. It was weirdly similar to the way the zombies had turned, but where the zombies had stared in eerie silence, these three newcomers gasped. Nate followed their gaze down to the road and saw the little girl zombie standing there waiting for them.
"She's trying to lure them out in the open,"
Nate thought, and answered that thought with the same mental breath.
"It'll never work. They can tell she's infected." "Ben," the older woman said, "what do you think?"
Then the younger woman muttered,
"Poor thing,"
and broke into a trot down the length of the driveway.
"No," Nate thought. "What are you doing?"
"Avery, no!" the older woman yelled. The man, the one called Ben, Nate remembered, took off running after the girl. Nate leaned forward, watching them, his hand reaching involuntarily into the empty air in front of him, pantomiming the man's actions as he tried to stop the girl before she ran right into the zombie's waiting arms. Just as he reached her, the girl stopped, turned toward the thicket next to the driveway, and let out a little scream as she staggered away from the two zombie women who had just emerged there. The man pulled the blonde girl behind him and drew his pistol, and shot one of the zombie women with his pistol. The zombie crumpled to the ground. He turned and shot the other zombie, but his aim was bad, and he managed to hit the woman in the shoulder, spinning her around without dropping her. The older woman with the wild gray hair yelled, "Get back, both of you!" She grabbed the blonde girl and pulled her toward the building. The child was attacking the man by then. She lunged for his arm and knocked the pistol loose. It went skittering across the driveway out of reach. The man backed away, then turned and ran for the old rusty car that was just beyond the awning. Nate watched, horrified, as the man barricaded himself inside the wreck. The little girl zombie climbed up onto the hood and started beating on the windshield. Then it caved in with a crash of breaking glass, and the little girl fell in with it and landed on top of the man inside the car. She was trying to claw her way through the busted windshield when the woman with the wild gray hair shot her in the back of the head. And then everything went still. The sound of the pistol shot faded away and seemed to take all the sound in the world with it. The two women pulled the man out of the wrecked car and led him down the driveway, where they studied something on one of the female zombies' legs.
"What do I do, Doc?"
he muttered. "Wait, Nate," Kellogg said. "Just wait, and watch." He heard a rumbling coming from a long ways off, and it took him a moment to realize that it was the sound of a truck coming toward the service station. Nate thought maybe he was imagining it, but then he saw the man and the two women looking at the road too, and they seemed frightened. The three of them started talking as one. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but the pretty blonde girl was gesturing toward the service bay where Nate was hiding. "No," he said. "Not here. Not here." The man was motioning toward the road. He pulled something that looked like a shaggy carpet from his backpack, and the three of them took off running.
"Yeah, that's it," he said. "Get going. Don't send their attention my way."
With a great deal of difficulty, he pulled himself to his feet and stumbled to the edge of the service bay, watching them go. Now that the sound was very close, he could tell that it was coming from several trucks.
"A caravan," he thought. "Jesus. You think it's a foraging party, Doc?"
"No way to tell, Nate. Stay out of sight for now."
"Right. Oh, shit, my stuff."
He ran over to his hammock and started wrestling with the ropes that secured it to the pumps.
Come on,
he said, tugging at the knots.
"Please."
Nate heard the sound of tires moving across the blacktop, and he looked to see a line of 4 trucks trundling into sight. They were Fords and Chevys, big black work trucks with oversized tires and loud exhausts. Black-clad soldiers with rifles rode in the first and last vehicle, while the middle two, with slatted wooden rails around the beds, seemed to be packed with zombies. The trucks rolled to a stop in the street in front of the station, and the soldiers jumped down from the beds of the trucks and set up a perimeter.
"What in the—"
Nate said, ducking quickly back into the service bay. 2 of the soldiers ran over to the dead zombies in the driveway, while another pair checked out the car where the little girl zombie had died. Nate pressed himself all the way back into the corner, murmuring a prayer that they wouldn't come inside the bay and find him. But as he did, he saw something odd. A man, painted head to toe in red, stepped from the second truck and walked part of the way up the driveway. He was bald, and his face looked bad, like maybe it had been scarred by acne when he was a teenager. He walked with a slight limp, and he didn't carry a weapon, but every black-clad soldier hurried to get out of his way. There was something menacing about the man that chilled Nate to the core, and it didn't help that the zombies in the trucks watched every move he made with unblinking attention. One of the soldiers removed the black thing from around the dead zombie's ankle and brought it to the red man. The red man took it without a word, turned it over in his hands as he examined it, and then handed it back to the soldier. Nate was so busy watching the exchange that he failed to notice the 2 soldiers up near the wrecked car where the little girl's headless body still protruded from the busted windshield. They had spotted the hammock and the gear on the ground and were silently peering into the service station's lobby. Nate finally noticed them when they looked around the corner and into the service bay. "Let me see your hands!" the soldier shouted, swinging his gun up and pointing it directly at Nate's face. A flashlight mounted below the gun's barrel came on, blinding Nate. He put up his hands and said, "No, wait, dude, I didn't do—" But the words were cut off mid-sentence, as the soldier came forward and planted the butt of the gun's stock squarely into Nate's teeth. An explosion of pain went through him, and his legs turned to sand. He sagged forward into the soldier's arms, and a moment later he was being dragged into the daylight and dropped at the red man's feet.
"What the hell is this?"
the red man said. Nate looked up at the red man. Sunlight glistened off his bare chest and off the dome of his bald head. "We found him hiding in the service bay," the soldier said. "Looks like he killed these other 3.
"You idiot," the red man said. "Look at him. He can't keep his balance. He's not even wearing a weapon."
The red man yelled up toward the station.
"Did you find a gun?"
"No, sir," another soldier answered. "Just a bunch of trash up here. His clothes and stuff."
"What's your name?"
"Nate Royal."
"And the others?"
the red man said.
"Where are they?"
Blood was oozing out of the corner of Nate's mouth and into his scraggly beard. He blinked a few times, trying to clear his head. Things were getting hazy again.
"Dude, why are you all red?" "Where are the others?"
Nate blinked at him.
"I don't know."
The red man grabbed him by the throat and hauled him to his feet.
"I won't ask you again. A man and 2 women came this way. Where are they?"
"Ask me all you want," Nate said. "I didn't see shit."
The red man glared at him. His nostrils flared with every breath he took. And as Nate struggled to breathe through the red man's iron grip around his throat, the red man bit the index finger of his own right hand. When he took it away, it was dripping blood.
"I will own you,"
the red man said, and jammed the bleeding finger into Nate's mouth. At first, Nate resisted. He tried to turn his head away, but the red man had too tight a grip around his throat. Desperate for air, he spread his clenched teeth apart and bit down on the red man's finger with everything he had. And he went on biting until he heard the sickening crunch of bone, and a gout of blood jetted over his tongue as his teeth ripped the finger off at the knuckle. The red man's howls filled the air. It was an unearthly sound, part rage, part lowing moan, but all of it echoing with pain. He dropped Nate to the ground and staggered backward, holding his bleeding hand in shock. Nate, for his part, didn't lose any time. There was a soldier advancing on him from behind. Nate leaped to his feet and spun around, throwing an elbow into the soldier's face and catching him cleanly on the jaw. The soldier dropped his weapon in surprise, and Nate was off, running toward the thicket as fast as he could run. He heard the red man screaming at his back, and a moment later, the soldiers yelling commands. They started firing as he slipped into the thicket. The next instant, the air around his head filled with the high-pitched whistles of ricocheting bullets. Nate didn't stop. He ducked his head and ran with everything he had. Chapter 9. Bullets chewed up the branches around his head. A wall of sound, like a wave, tore at his heels. Nate, breathless and sick, was panting in terror. His vision tunneled. Eyes went wide with terror. Spittle flecked on his lips. Every muscle strained to carry him faster, faster from the red man's soldiers as they bore down upon him, with their guns roaring and their screams swelling up behind him like some huge beast, gaining on him with every step. He found a pig trail. Running blind with his hands in front of him, swatting at the endless tangle of branches in his face, he twisted through the underbrush. The soldiers were on either side of him, closing on him, and above it all he could hear the red man roaring in his pain and rage.
"Get him back here! I want him now!"
And the soldiers, their voices like an echo, yelling,
"Get him! He's over here! I see him over here!"
The steady roll of the guns slacked off to a series of scattered pops, and he turned quickly to look behind him. The red man's soldiers were entering the woods right behind him. He could see their hunched-over black silhouettes moving through the thicket with terrific speed. Panting, sticks and leaves caught in his scraggly beard, Nate Royal ran with no idea where he was going. The will to live that had been lacking earlier, when he was caught in his hammock by the zombies, came back to him as a full-blown, blind panic adrenaline surge. And though his skin was laced with cuts, he felt none of it. The world was a wolf pack snapping at his heels, driving him deeper into the woods. He crossed a muddy creek bed, and when he came up on the other side, the pig trail had vanished. The air was full of leaves and thick with the smell of rotting vegetation. Ahead of him, the ground rose abruptly to a small ridge. The the slope of a slick carpet of wet brown leaves. Chancing a look behind him, he saw one of the red man's soldiers closing fast. Nate let out a startled yelp and ran up the slope. He lost his footing and had to scramble up to the top of the ridge with his fingertips digging into the damp earth. The soldier clamped a hand down on Nate's shoulder as they crested the ridge, and Nate screamed. Their momentum carried them over the top, and then they were falling down the slope on the other side. Nate landed in a thick layer of dark mud. The soldier came down next to him, his forehead striking a jagged corner of a large rock, with a sickening crunch of broken bone. Breathing hard, Nate looked at the soldier. The man's eyes were wide open and frozen in sightless surprise. Part of his skull, thick and jagged and honeycombed inside, jutted up from the wound amid a thick, black, spreading ooze of blood. He could see the brain inside, grayish-yellow, like old cheese. Nate drew back in horror, his breath hitching in his throat. More soldiers were coming. He could hear them just on the other side of the ridge, and Nate was scrambling to his feet when he saw the dead soldier's AR-15 poking out from under his body. "Oh, damn!" he muttered. He pulled on the weapon and managed to free it from the soldier's weight. But it was caught on something. He yanked on the gun, again and again, until he saw the black nylon strap still securing the gun to the soldier's shoulder.
"No,"
he said, still tugging on the gun.
"Come on, please."
3 more soldiers crested the ridge above him. Without aiming, Nate raised the rifle and emptied the entire magazine into their guts. All 3 doubled over and slid face first into the thick carpet of leaves. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds, and though Nate saw every detail, it was as though he was outside of himself, looking down. The guns made no sound. All he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears, his heart pounding in his chest. The moments seemed to stretch on forever. And then, suddenly, the spell was broken. His senses opened up, and it was like a wave breaking all around him. Time accelerated to normal speed. More soldiers were yelling, coming closer. And meanwhile, Nate, stunned and lightheaded, was looking down at 2 dead soldiers and a third who was groaning like an animal struggling to give birth.
"He'll be dead in less than 3 minutes,"
Nate thought, surprised by his detachment. The shouting was growing very loud.
"Oh, shit,"
he said, and dropped the rifle, and turned and ran through the woods. He ran parallel to the stream bed for about 100 yards, then dropped behind a tree and sank to his knees in a thick blanket of rotten leaves. Nate could hear voices coming toward him. "You see him? Clear over here! You 2 cross back over the stream bed, see if he doubled back on us."
"They've lost me,"
he thought, but he couldn't run anymore. Years earlier, long before the outbreak, he'd shattered his ankle running from the police, and now the ankle was starting to pulse. Any more movement, and that pulsing would turn to unbearable waves of pain. The leaves beneath him felt deep. He tested it by jamming a hand down until he touched bottom, maybe 6 inches.
"Good enough,"
he thought, and hurriedly buried himself. 2 of the soldiers passed inches from his left shoulder, and then stopped near his feet. "He couldn't walk through that stuff down there without leaving tracks," one of the men said.
"Yeah,"
agreed the other. "Back up that way."
"Please, oh please, I need a break."
Flat on his stomach, peering out at a little patch of thicket from the cover of the leaves, Nate listened as the soldiers moved away. He let out a long breath and waited, straining his ears for the sound of voices and breaking twigs.
"What do I do, Doc?"
he muttered. Kellogg knelt beside him. "Shh! Don't move. Don't speak. They're moving away." And from the sounds of their voices, Nate knew it was true. They were a good ways off, and moving farther away with every passing second. He closed his eyes and laughed. then winced at the sharp pain in his ribs. But it felt good to know he had saved himself. The pain aside, it felt good to know that he was still alive, and he laughed again. But it was a considerably more subdued Nate Royal who, later that evening, found himself within sight of the Mississippi River without any food or fresh water or blankets under which to sleep. His headache, his aches, his fever chills, they were all returning now in spades, repaying him for the exertions of the morning and the all-day walking. With his vision turning soupy at the edges, he stumbled toward the water, figuring he would drink and take his chances. Rivers that ran through cities had bad water, he had learned. But he was desperate. Ahead of him, the water was plum-colored in the pale light of the setting sun. It seemed as flat and calm as a sheet of cooled lead. He saw a pair of white birds gliding over the water, and it seemed very peaceful, until the quiet was broken by the giggling of a pair of young girls. He stopped, dead in his tracks. They crossed the trail in front of him, maybe 10 feet away, completely unaware of his presence. He only caught a glimpse of them, a young girl of about 8, and an older one, a teenager, about 13 or 14. They were both dressed in simple white dresses, and they were carrying baskets filled with blackberries and wild corn. "Wait," he said, stumbling after them. Though his mouth and throat were so dry, only a gasp of air escaped. "Nate, no," Kellogg pleaded with him. "Don't. Watch them first." But Nate wasn't listening. He hurt everywhere. The ringing in his ears had grown painful beyond the point that he could stand. He just wanted to fall over and drink some water before he passed out. He turned down a thin side trail and caught a second glimpse of the girls as they entered a clearing. Nate smelled the faint tinge of wood smoke and heard other voices talking, laughing. Crashing down the side trail, he staggered into a clearing and found himself standing in the midst of a camp, 6 people staring at him. It took a moment before anybody could react. 2 young men in their 20s grabbed shotguns and pointed them at Nate. He looked from one barrel to the other, swaying on his feet, and blinked. "Don't shoot me," he muttered, but wasn't sure if the sound came out or not. The others just stared at him. Everyone was on their feet now. He saw an older woman in her late 50s put her arms around the 2 little girls and pull them back. A younger boy, who looked about 5 and was holding a thick stick blackened at one end, stared at Nate with wide, terrified eyes. There was a pile of fresh tinder smoking and popping in the fire pit in front of him. Nate looked at one of the men holding a shotgun. The man adjusted his grip on the weapon. "I'm not infected," Nate said, and coughed. "Please, help me." "Turn around," the man said. He raised the shotgun to his shoulder and squinted one eye down the length of the barrel. "Do it now!" With effort, Nate raised both hands and showed the men his palms. He could barely keep his head up. He turned slowly, clumsily, and stopped with his back to the men. "Run, Nate," Kellogg said. "Run while you've still got the chance." "I can't," he said. "You can't what?" one of the men said. Nate lowered his hands slightly. "I can't run," he said. "You just stay right there," the man said. Then to the other man he said, "You see anything?" "No." "Hey, man, you bit any place?" "No," Nate said. "What's that?" "No," he said again, straining to be heard. "I'm thirsty." The older woman said, "He's sick, Jason. It looks like he's got the flu. It looks like he came out the back end of a goat is what it looks like." "Eddie, what do you think?" "Hell, I don't know. I can't see any bite marks on him." "I'm not bit," Nate said. "I know what you said," a voice said. It sounded like Eddie's voice, but Nate was still turned around and couldn't see them.
"Just stay there."
Then Eddie lowered his voice a little and said,
"Go down there and tell Dad we got a sick man up here. Ask him what he wants us to do."
Nate turned slightly and saw the little boy throw down the stick and run off toward the river. He also saw the one named Eddie bring up his shotgun again.
"Just stay there, mister."
Can I sit down?
Nate said. "Nope. Just stay where you're at."
A moment later, the little boy ran back into the camp.
Daddy said to bring him on down. He wants to look at him.
"All right," Eddie said. "Come on, mister. Turn around real slow."
Nate did as the man asked, and Eddie motioned him down toward the river with the barrel of the shotgun. The path led him down to the bank and around a stand of willows. There was a man there, lying on his side, a fishing pole in his hands. He was a thin man, his high, oddly square-shaped head going bald on top, and the little hair he had left was as soft and white as powder snow. He was smiling when he turned around, but the smile slipped a little as he took in the sight of Nate standing before him.
"Good Lord," he muttered.
The man planted his hands palm down in the witchgrass and struggled up from the bank like an animal that has had its back legs run over by a car and is now pulling itself out of the road. It was an ungainly motion, one that Nate found disgusting. Only then did Nate notice that the man's legs were tied together with loose, yellowed bandages that seemed to have soaked through from underneath. "This is wrong, Nate," Kellogg said. "This is all wrong. Get up and run."
"What happened to you, son?"
I was running,
Nate said.
through the woods.
"What from?" Kellogg leaned into his ear.
"Don't say a word, Nate. Not a word."
But the man was waiting, looking him in the eye. Nate found it hard to look at him. The injuries to his legs had an unnatural look that turned Nate's stomach. "What were you running from, son? Was it zombies?"
I don't know,
Nate said.
Could have been. Could have been wild hogs, I don't know. I hid in some leaves.
"Well, hopefully you didn't pick up any ticks. Last thing you want is to get sick with Lyme disease. You probably wouldn't survive it." Nate said nothing. "What other symptoms do you have?" the man said.
Huh?
"You running a fever? I heard you coughing just a bit ago. You feel congested? Sneezy at all? Achy?"
Yeah, all that.
"How long you been sick?"
Couple of days. I'm real thirsty, mister.
"I bet. It's all right, son. My name's Don Fisher. I'm a doctor. You already met the rest of my family, I guess?" Nate just looked at him. His head was swimming so badly he wasn't catching but every other word.
Could I have some water?
He said. The man nodded. "Eddie, can you do that for me, please? Get him some water. And bring me a package of Tamiflu." Eddie nodded and started to walk off, but Fisher called out to him. "And Eddie, better bring me a package of Zithromax, too. Just in case." Nate was feeling like he needed to throw up. It was getting harder and harder to stand. Fisher, recognizing the look, said, "Go ahead and sit down, son. Sit down before you fall down."
You're not gonna hurt me, are you?
Fisher gave him a curious look. "No, son. I'm a doctor. Sit down. Nobody's going to hurt you." Nate tried to sit, but what he actually did was closer to falling. He looked over at Fisher, and the man nodded. Then he planted his palms in the grass again, and pulled himself over to where Nate sat. Nate, for his part, tried unsuccessfully not to flinch. It was like watching a poisonous snake inch closer and closer. Fisher pulled himself up alongside Nate and felt his forehead. "Yeah, you're burning up. We need to get that fever down." "Ah, good. Here's Eddie." Eddie handed Nate a mason jar full of water. The water looked clear and clean, but Nate would have drunk it all down, even if it had come straight up from the river. Nate took a sip of the water. His cracked lips hurt on the rim of the jar, and his throat felt like it had broken glass stuffed down it. But he went on drinking. "When was the last time you ate, son?"
I don't know.
The man nodded to himself. "Well, this won't hurt your stomach even without food." He had 2 shiny tinfoil cards with blister packs of pills on them. "These white and yellow pills, these are Tamiflu. Take 1 in the morning and 1 at night. These pink ones are Zithromax, an antibiotic. You take this once a day. You understand?" Nate didn't, but he nodded like he did. "Let's get you started right away." Fisher popped the pills from the blister pack and handed them to Nate. Nate swallowed both with the remainder of the water in the jar. "You want some more water?" Fisher said, watching him closely. Nate nodded, his eyes closed. His throat was killing him. Eddie brought another jar of water, and Nate took it gratefully. But he passed out before he had a chance to finish it. When he woke, it was dark. The river was an immense sheet of black stretching far off into the distance. Nate could hear a soft murmur of mosquitoes in the tall weeds at the water's edge, and somewhere, out on the water, the muffled plunk of a fish breaking the surface. He rolled over and saw the campfire had worked itself down to a flickering bed of embers, glowing softly in the darkness, its orange light casting a faint glow over the sleeping faces of Fisher's wife and her 2 youngest children. He couldn't see the 2 younger men or the teenage girl. "Are you awake?" Fisher's voice, coming from behind him, startled Nate. He rolled over and looked at the man. "How are you feeling?" Nate coughed.
Still hurting.
"It'll take you a while to get better. A few days at least. You're going to need to get yourself cleaned up before you head off again. It'll do your morale some good to cut your hair and get rid of that beard. You could stand a new set of clothes while you're at it." Nate closed his eyes and tried to make the world stop spinning.
"How am I going to do all that?"
he said. "You're about Eddie's size. We'll give you what you need." Nate opened his eyes, then narrowed them at Fisher, trying to see the man's motives in his face.
"Why?"
Fisher just smiled. "Why not?"
"You don't know me. Why are you doing this?"
"That's true. I don't know you. What's your name?" Warning lights flashed in Nate's brain. This was exactly the thing Kellogg had warned him about. "We can learn to like other people," Kellogg had said, "even love them. But we can't ever truly know them, and so we remain isolated." The words played through his head like they'd been spoken only yesterday, though in reality it had been, 6 years ago? 7? "Don't want to tell me, huh?" Nate shook his head slightly. "That's okay. But listen, son, there is going to come a day when you will have to trust somebody. You can't survive in this world without trust. Look at how hard it is. Look at all the things you have to do for yourself if you're the only one you trust. You'll probably be dead before you're 40 if you don't learn to spread some of the labor around. It's the helping each other that gives the world meaning, son. Gives us a sense that we belong to something."
"But that's a lie,"
Nate thought, once again remembering the words Kellogg had spoken to him all those years ago.
"We're not allowed to know why life has meaning. Not for sure, anyway. And yet we feel compelled to create some sort of answer. It's an absurd downward spiral of impossible things, and yet it is our lives."
"I'm okay for now," Nate said. Fisher looked him over with a doubtful expression on his face. "Well, at least one of us is. Excuse me for a second."
"Huh?"
Nate turned at a sound behind him. One of Fisher's sons, not Eddie, but the other one, whose name Nate had forgotten, was coming down the path with a large syringe in his hand. He walked right past Nate and handed the syringe over to his father. "Thanks, Jason." The young man leaned down and kissed Fisher on the top of his bald head.
"Susan's on the way. She's getting the water."
Fisher nodded. Nate sat there, watching the syringe closely. "Don't worry," Fisher said, smiling warmly. "It's not for you." Nate didn't reply. Fisher's oldest daughter was coming down the path, carrying a white tray. On the tray, Nate saw a glass measuring cup with a little bit of water in the bottom, some kind of stove burner, a couple of red and white packets of Fleischmann's yeast, and a single slice of bread. The girl put the tray down next to her father.
"Good night, Daddy. I'm going to turn in."
"Okay, sweetheart. I'll come check on you later." She bent down and kissed Fisher, just as her brother had done, and then went back up to the campsite. "Do you see what I mean?" Fisher said. He was setting up the stove, turning on the gas and lighting it with a match he struck on the side of his shoe. Being with other people. Sartre was wrong. It's anything but hell. It's our connection to them that makes us strong. That's what gives our lives meaning. Nate kept his silence. Perhaps Fisher hadn't intended for him to respond, because he went immediately to work setting the glass measuring cup on a small metal rack over the burner's low flame. Both men watched it work in silence, and after a few minutes, Fisher reached into his pocket and removed a thermometer from his shirt pocket. "The yeast needs the water at 105 degrees. He dunked the thermometer into the measuring cup and watched the mercury rise. "Takes a few minutes," he said. He looked at Nate and smiled. Nate listened to the mosquitoes buzzing a short distance off. Somewhere out in the woods, an owl hooted. "There it is," Fisher said. He removed the thermometer and poured in the yeast, and swirled the measuring cup around to distribute the mixture. Then he took the syringe and squirted the thick, reddish liquid inside into the yeast mixture. "Stuff tastes horrible without the yeast," he said. Then he poured the liquid onto the slice of bread and ate it, wincing at the taste. "Of course, it tastes horrible with it, too, but it won't work without it." Then Fisher pushed the plate away and rolled over on his back, staring up at the stars. Nate did the same. There were no clouds, and very little breeze. A pleasant night. It had been a long time since Nate had looked at the stars, really looked at them, and he was amazed at how many there were. They filled the sky, and for the first time in his life he realized how people could see patterns up there. "You don't talk much, do you, Nate?" Nate turned his head. Fisher was still looking at the stars, his hands laced together behind his head.
"Not really, no,"
Nate said. "How about a family? Mom? Dad?"
"My mom died when I was little. My dad was going with his girlfriend to pick up her parents when the outbreak hit Martindale. I don't know what happened to him. I guess he's dead."
"So it's just you?" Nate rubbed the flash drive through his shirt.
"Yeah, just me."
There was a flash of movement as Fisher flipped over onto his belly and pushed himself up with his hands. He dragged himself toward the path that led up to the rest of the campsite, then stopped and turned around. "I hope you find what you're looking for, son, and I hope you find it soon. It's a big, lonely world out there without other people." Nate watched him go in silence, and when he was out of sight, Nate rolled over onto his back again and watched the stars until he fell asleep. He woke the next morning with sunlight on his face. Nate listened for the sound of voices and heard nothing but birds squawking at each other. Slowly he rose to his feet. He was still stiff in his shoulders and in his lower back, but his head was clearer. He touched his forehead, and it was cool. And, he realized, last night had been the first time in 2 or 3 days where he hadn't woken in the middle of the night, trembling from head to foot. Had the fever broken? "Hello?" he called out. No answer came back to him. He turned up the path and climbed to the campsite, but no one was there. There wasn't a single piece of trash anywhere. The stones that had ringed the fire were still in place, but the embers had been buried in dirt. Here and there he saw faint footprints and the impressions of bedrolls where the individual members of the family had slept. The only thing they'd left behind was a cardboard box, tucked just out of sight of the side path that led back to the main path between the road and the river. Nate pulled the box out and looked inside. He found a bar of soap sitting on top of a change of clothes, a blue backpack, a bedroll, a pair of scissors, some razors, a mason jar, a small cast-iron pan, a can of wolf chili, and the rest of the medicine Fisher had given him the night before. The blister packs were stashed inside a plastic zip-top baggie, with a handwritten note under the baggie. It read, "Hope this helps. Cut your hair and beard and take a long bath in the river with the soap. You'll feel better, I promise. Also, don't forget to take one of the yellow and white pills in the morning and at night, and one of the pink in the morning. Take them all, even when you start to feel better. Good luck to you, son. And remember, the sooner you learn to trust others, the sooner you'll find what you're looking for. Best, Don Fisher." Nate took a long time working his way through the note. Even back in high school, when they were putting him through those special classes and working with him every day, he had a lot of trouble deciphering something that was more than 4 or 5 words long. But eventually he got the sense pulled out of it and put the note aside. Then he picked up the scissors and the soap and headed down to the river. Chapter 10. Richardson awoke to the muffled pop, pop, pop of automatic weapons fire. At first he didn't recognize it for what it was. He lay still, his eyes wide open, listening, trying to zero in on the sound and identify it. His eyes were itchy, watery, his sinuses congested. The hay and dust in the barn's loft were playing havoc with his allergies, and his senses seemed wrapped in a fog that wouldn't dispel. Pop, pop! Pop, 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 pop! The second time there was no mistaking the sound. Guns. Lots of them. And he could hear men yelling, too. Richardson sat up and looked around.
"What was that?"
Sylvia said. Like him, she was sitting up, a startled expression on her face. There was hay on her clothes and in her shaggy mass of gray hair. Avery Harper had slept next to her, curled up like a child. All the walking they'd done the day before had left her exhausted, and she'd been the first to fall asleep. But now even Avery was coming around.
"What's going on?"
she said groggily, rubbing the side of her head. "Gunfire," he said. Richardson scrambled to the wall on his hands and knees and peered through the slats. He could see a corner of a farmhouse and a large, overgrown field on the other side of the house. Before the outbreak, the field had been used for corn, and he could still see remnants of that crop out there, though now the ordered rows were rangy and crowded with spindly shrubs and weeds. Looking closely, he saw a dozen or so men crouched in the field, using the tall weeds for cover. They were firing in every direction, pinned down by a squad of black shirts.
"That's Jude McHenry," Sylvia said. "Damn it, how did they find us?"
Richardson let out a sigh. Looking back on it, it wasn't much of a mystery. The scraggly-looking man the soldiers pulled from the gas station service bay had saved their lives. He led the Red Man soldiers away on a wild chase, and when the soldiers returned empty-handed, the Red Man and his caravan moved out, leaving Richardson, Sylvia, and Avery a little confused by what had just happened, but still conscious of the fact that they had dodged a mighty big bullet. Foolishly, he realized now, Richardson had let himself think they were in the clear. They'd walked the remainder of the day, eating fruit they found growing along the road and chatting happily, eventually coming to this farmhouse, where Richardson managed to shoot a small turkey hen with his pistol, while the women gathered